Welcome to Protect the Election, Protect Our Democracy, a conversation with Nate Persily. I'm Priscilla Enriquez, CEO of the James B. McClatchy Foundation, otherwise known as JBMF, and we are proud to partner with the Sacramento Federal Judicial Library and Learning Center Foundation, also otherwise known as SAC-JLC. Please learn more about our respective organizations by visiting our websites or following us on Facebook or Twitter. Check the chat for more information. I especially want to thank a champion for democracy, Susan McClatchy, founder and board member of JBMF, and of course, her late husband, the James B. McClatchy. We most especially are grateful that you've joined us, sharing your evening with us on the eve of the last presidential debate, and with our nation only 13 days from an election like no other. We appreciate very much that you care to devote your time to listen and learn this evening. Voter engagement is exceptionally high, as is voter suppression, obfuscation of facts and information, disinformation awry on social media, confusion about alternative ways to vote. Plus, it's the COVID era. Here to help us best understand what is at stake, why our democracy matters so much in this moment, and what might folks do about it, is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford University, also founder of the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, and NBC News legal analyst, Nate Persily, who has equally as depth of passion on this issue and has been speaking nationally on this topic. He has taught at numerous acclaimed law schools, including Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, as a visiting professor at Harvard, NYU, Princeton, and University of Amsterdam, and the University of Melbourne. His areas of thought leadership include voting rights, political parties, campaign finance, redistricting, and election administration. He's held several state-level congressional and legislative roles and served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Author of dozens of articles, many of which have been cited by the Supreme Court, and on the legal regulation of political parties, issues surrounding the census and redistricting process, voting rights, and campaign finance reform. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Nate Persily. And joining in this conversation, it will be moderated by JBMF board member and national media expert Joaquin Alvarado. Joaquin Alvarado is a media and nonprofit leader with over 20 years of successfully developing innovative approaches, programs, and organizations. From strategy to sustainability, Joaquin has engaged in widely recognized and substantial initiatives in public service journalism. As the founder of Studio To Be, Joaquin invests in finding and sharing stories that matter. Prior to Studio To Be, he ran the Center for Investigative Reporting, the nation's oldest and largest journalism organization of its kind. He has led large organizations and teams to focus on the challenges pressuring journalists and impinging upon freedom of the press. As a consultant, Joaquin has crafted and guided important new initiatives with major national media organizations, corporations, and foundations. He provides expertise based on his experience in governance, strategic planning, and change management. Joaquin holds a BA from UC Berkeley and an MFA from UCLA. He serves on several boards, including Consumer Reports and, of course, JBMF. So really, really honored to have both of them here tonight. I will now turn this over to Joaquin, who will guide the conversation and offer you ways to engage in the conversation. And I will kindly hide my video and join you all at the close. We are most thankful to our honored guests, Nate and Joaquin, for their time, expertise, and generosity in sharing their knowledge. Thank you again, and enjoy the conversation. All right.
Thank you, Priscilla, and thank you to and you, Nate, for being with us this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping for folks. Please do use the Q&A. If you want to get questions in, I'll be keeping an eye on that. That we'll incorporate when we get to that part of our conversation. But Nate, thanks for being here. We're actually going to start, I think, with a little bit of an overview presentation from you, Nate, about sort of this question on election security and fidelity and what are the issues around that. So I'll hand it over to you, Nate, and then we'll come back and get into a Q&A.
Sure thing. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to the Judicial Center and to the McClatchy Foundation. You can tell from my voice that I'm doing quite a few presentations, talking head appearances and the like, because this is my season when it comes to elections. This is the World Series. And as Priscilla mentioned earlier, in addition to all the work that I've been doing at Stanford, and really which was the foundation of the McClatchy Professorship there, where I'm the head, not only sort of teaching classes in the law school, but also in the university generally on issues such as the First Amendment. I also direct the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and the program on democracy and the internet. And if you had asked me in January what I thought I'd be working on for the next 10 months or so, it would have been on the same types of problems that plagued the 2016 election, issues of disinformation, issues of hate speech, platform policy, and the like. And I've been spending most of my time over the last 7 years since I joined Stanford, really focusing on the impact of the internet on democracy. However, when the pandemic hit and its effect on the election became apparent, I took off my hat as director of the Cyber Policy Center and then put on my hat that I used to wear when I was the research director of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. This was the commission that President Obama put together to deal with things like long lines on election day, voting technology, natural disasters in voting. For some reason, we didn't predict that we'd be dealing with pandemics in voting. But through that experience, I developed a lot of relationships with local and state election officials to deal with the real nuts and bolts of the electoral process. And so, along with Charles Stewart, who's really the nation's top expert on election management at MIT, he and I started this Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, which you can find at healthyelections.org. With some initial seed funding from the Hewlett Foundation, we've developed a sort of research portal as well as best practices guide for election officials to help them combat the virus and to make sure that our elections are safe and secure. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the impact of COVID-19 on this election and on the administration of this election. So let's just start with what the problem is. The problem that confronts us in election administration this year is how do we move tens of millions of people to a new system of voting that they're not familiar with? And so it'd be one thing if we had 2 years to make these transitions. But as I'll show you, many of these states have not had large numbers of people who've been voting by mail and have had to move tens of millions of people in the space of 4 months to a new system of voting. Now, the solutions to this problem of ensuring social distance in voting and making sure that people are not susceptible to the virus, as we say in the election administration field, this is not rocket surgery, right? You need to move as many people to vote by mail as possible, and then retrofit as many polling places as possible to avoid the risk of contagion for voters. Now, this is not as easy as most people think. You cannot flick a switch and then just have everyone get a mail ballot. In places like California, we've made that transition because we had a substantial number of our voters who had already been voting by mail. But for most of the country, that would be impossible. Also, I want to emphasize something that's going to become more important even over the next week, which is that these choices are really poles on a continuum. They're not a dichotomous choice. So there's all kinds of intermediate solutions, and we're learning about them here in California, for example, where you could vote, get a mail ballot, and then turn it in to a ballot drop box or bring the mail ballot to a polling place. And so there are other kinds of intermediate options between full mail balloting on the one hand and polling place voting on the other. And all jurisdictions, for the most part, with the exception of the vote by mail states, are going to have some mix of the two of these ideal types. Now, there are some familiar constraints when it comes to making election changes in the United States. The first is time and money. Right now, I'd say time is more constrained than money is. Congress appropriated $400 million in the CARES Act to deal with election issues. That was helpful, but about 10% of what is needed. Private donations have actually now gone into public coffers. So you may have heard of the Chan Zuckerberg initiative giving $250 to $300 million to help out local election jurisdictions pull off this election. And that money is going to go toward buying sort of the people, places, and things that are necessary for this election. We need to hire a whole new cadre of poll workers. We need to get new polling places that can ensure social distance, and we need the things like PPE to make sure that voters and poll workers can be safe. But the most scarce resource right now is time. We needed more time to prepare for this election, more time to vote, more time to count the ballots, and more time to announce the results, which I'll talk about toward the end. Now, when you talk about American election reform, you can't ignore the structural impediments that make this kind of reform very difficult in the American system, make us different than other countries. So in the United States, we not only decentralize election administration down to 50 states, but we push it down to another 10,000 local jurisdictions. This makes a kind of national response to, say, dealing with the coronavirus impact on elections very difficult. Compounding that is the same problems that we've seen outside the election sphere when it comes to dealing with COVID, which is that we have sort of ill-fitted laws and regulations for the emergency environment like this, as well as contracting and procurement regulations that make it difficult for us, for example, to acquire the necessary materials like ballot sorting equipment or the like on the emergency time schedule that's necessary for to combat the virus and to run this election. Now, when you think of issues of election management, your mind probably naturally gravitates toward partisan polarization and how we as a country are so divided, and particularly at the national level on issues of mail voting, there's lots of contention and acrimony. When you get down to the local level, you actually don't see much difference between, say, Republican and Democratic administrators in the way that they tackle these problems. Something like vote by mail is not a controversial issue among local administrators of whatever party, because Republican and Democratic local administrators have the same motivation, which is that they want to make sure that their face doesn't end up on the front page the following morning. And so something like vote by mail or absentee balloting, which will allow you to sort of shuttle a lot of voters into the process earlier to make sure there aren't long lines on election day, is something that's supported really by both parties at the local level. Finally, when you think of the constraints on this process, the unpredictability of the virus has made this particularly difficult. We're seeing now, obviously, a renewed surge in virus cases, something that might have been predictable, but you never really knew over the summer what the sort of situation would be on election day. Now, local election officials have prepared their polling places to ensure social distance and the like, but there are all other aspects of the electoral process. For example, the canvassing boards and the election offices that need to be prepared for the unpredictability of the virus. For example, if someone in a poll worker training session turns out to have been tested positive for the virus, how does that affect everything downstream from that? So let me talk about those two options, mail balloting and polling place voting, and what we've seen. Now, the epidemic has turbocharged a transition that had been long in the making, which is that Americans have been slowly moving toward non-election day polling place voting for some time. About 25% of Americans had cast their vote by mail in the 2016 election. It's going to be about double that in this election. We expect around half of Americans to cast votes by mail. And when we say cast votes by mail, we don't just mean through the Postal Service. About half of those, or roughly half of those, will either drop them off at a polling place or drop them off at an election office themselves or in an exterior ballot drop box. But the vote by mail landscape up until this point has been highly variable geographically. In the West, you can see that there are the permanent vote by mail states of Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii. These are states that mail every registered voter a mail ballot. They've been joined this year by California, New Jersey, District of Columbia, Vermont, and to some extent, Montana. These now are the states that are the ones that are mailing out ballots to every voter. But as you can see from the map here, there's in most of the battleground states, places like Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they have no excuse absentee balloting, meaning that anyone can get a mail ballot. They just have to ask for it, and they don't have to provide a doctor's note or a doctor's excuse, for example, as they have to do in Texas. And that's why this whole issue of controversies over vote by mail in this election is really beside the point. That in those battleground states, they all vote they have the same rules when it comes to absentee balloting, at least as to who's eligible to vote in absentee ballot. So just as the president votes an absentee ballot in Florida, so too in North Carolina and the Midwestern battleground states, that's the same procedure which is at issue there. What you can see though from this table, as I'm sorry how small it is, but I wanted to put all the states on there, and you can see the arrows are the battleground states in the presidential race. That North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin have historic rates of absentee balloting of 6%, 4%, and 3%. And so for those states to make the transition to half of their voters voting by mail is a major logistical undertaking, as compared to, say, Arizona, where almost 80% of their voters cast ballots by mail, or here in California, where 2/3 of our voters have cast ballots by mail. It's a much less onerous task to make that transition. Now, if you've been following the news, you will see lots of stories about challenges with vote by mail. Of course, for the president, he has reiterated time and again the concern about fraud. Now, there isn't a whole lot of examples of fraud when it comes to absentee voting, but there is certainly a perception of fraud, and we're seeing that more in splitting along partisan lines, with Democrats less likely to believe there's fraud in absentee balloting and Republicans more likely to believe it. But usually when the critique of absentee balloting even the word fraud often encapsulates a whole set of issues surrounding absentee balloting. So while it's not the case that you're going to see thousands of imaginary people or foreigners who end up voting by mail illegally in this election, you will see concerns about the system itself and dysfunction when it comes to absentee balloting. Now, historically, one of the concerns has been that the absentee ballot pool has usually been older, whiter, more educated, and of people who've lived in locations for quite some time, right? And so racial minorities have been less likely to vote by mail. That is changing this election, it seems, and we're seeing a partisan difference in who votes by mail, with Democrats about twice as likely as Republicans now to be voting by mail, particularly in battleground states. But it's critical that we also have healthy polling places because we need to make sure that those voters who distrust the mail, and there's a rising tide of them who do, have a place to vote. Those voters with disabilities who need assistance in voting, people who want to register on the same day as they vote in those states that allow it, need polling places or something comparable. And for the over 1 million people who will ask for absentee ballots but not receive them in this election, going to a polling place may be the best way and easiest way for them to vote. One of the challenges, though, with absentee balloting, though, is that it is more complicated than in-person voting for a lot of people. And so one of the things, if you go to healthyelections.org and you look at some of the state reports that we put up there, you'll notice that you see some significant disparities along demographic lines in whether certain absentee votes get counted or not. A lot of this has to do with whether you're a first-time voter, because while it may seem, particularly the Californians, most of us have been, majority of us have been voting by mail for some time. For someone who hasn't voted by mail, it takes an election conduct to learn the process, that you have to sign the outside of the ballot, what the deadlines are, how far in advance you need to mail it. So we will see close to 500,000, if not more, absentee ballots that will not get counted this year. Most due to lateness, but then also to issues dealing with, say, missing signatures or missing witness signatures or signature mismatches, all of which could lead to disqualification of a ballot. So given the challenges with vote by mail, an effective electoral administration system also has to have healthy polling places. This is something we've worked with in the Healthy Elections Project with the Stanford Design School to help design healthy polling places and give advice to poll workers and election officials, which you can see at healthypolls.stanford.edu. But as I said earlier, the challenge with polling places is basically a problem of people, places, and things. And so what we need is a whole new crop of poll workers. The average age of poll worker in the United States is over 60 years old. Many of those folks do not want to serve as poll workers because they are at greater risk from the virus. And so that's required a massive recruitment effort, mainly by election officials, but also non-governmental organizations such as powerthepolls.org, to try to make sure that we get hundreds of thousands of new poll workers into the polling places. Now, it's not enough just to get them registered and have their names on an email list. And Power the Polls has registered or gotten over 400,000 people to volunteer through its or sign up through its website. But we got to make sure that they're trained. And poll worker training is a real challenge in this environment because just like everything else we're doing, it's going to have to be done over Zoom or with social distance. And voting in this election is going to be quite different than it has been historically. So not only these poll workers have to be acquainted with the technology and rules of a polling place, but they've also got to be there to deal with the COVID environment and ensure social distancing. And that's why we need also, in addition to new people, we need new places. Many polling stations, such as old senior living centers and firehouses, are closed as a result of COVID. And so that's required that we acquire a whole nother set of places where people can vote. You may have seen that the NBA and some other sports teams have volunteered their stadiums as early voting centers in order to make sure that people can vote in very large facilities. Many other types of facilities are just taken out of commission. The two types I mentioned before, plus some schools don't want to have strangers coming in from the outside on a Tuesday in November. And so it's required that we've had a lot of new polling places. This sometimes will cause confusion among voters because they're used to voting in one type of polling place, but then they're being told to go to another one. And finally, we need to acquire the things, the PPE, the masks, the sanitizer and the like. And so we need and have undertaken a massive education and outreach program, both for poll workers and for voters. We need to ensure that we need to think creatively, as election officials have, about the temporal and physical spacing of voting, spacing it out during the day, during the weeks beforehand, and making sure that we are creative in rethinking polling places. For example, curbside voting, arena voting, or even taking a number and vote, sort of like what we do in restaurants. And we need to sort of have an all hands on deck approach between corporate America, which has stepped up, as you can see in the list of corporations that we've discussed, and healthyelections.org, as well as all organs of government, including the Postal Service. But it can be done, and you can see from South Korea, which ran its election in the heat of the pandemic, how they were able to pull this off. They even took temperatures of people coming into the polling place. They had hand sanitizer, masks, and the like. They even scanned election observers with heat sensors as they came into the polling place. And then candidates would vote their ballots. They even had separate segregated facilities for people who were COVID positive. So if we had a central sort of government that was able to work the kinks out of this system, we'd be able to do it. But as I said, time now is running out. We're less than 2 weeks away from the election, so all the rules have now been set. We need more time to vote, and so the early voting has proven absolutely critical. We have over 40 million Americans who've now cast their ballot, which is roughly, I don't know, we expect about 150 million who will end up voting, so it's roughly 30% or so. We need more time to administer the election, and that is running out. We need more time to count the votes, and we need more time to announce the results. And I want to focus on those last 2 points, which is this: an election where half the votes are cast by mail is a different type of election, where we need to be patient. We don't know how big the margin of victory is going to be. But if it's close, then we may need to wait several days, maybe even a week, in order to find out who the winner is, as absentee ballots get processed in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so that's why we started the Healthy Elections Project. You can visit us at healthyelections.org. We've put up over 500 pages of original research there that the Stanford and MIT students have helped put together. We're trying to push it out to election officials and voters alike. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, Nate, thank you for that. I got a couple right off the bat. I mean, with all of the potential interventions to improve the process and the lack of time, which you addressed at the end, how are we doing? What do you see happening right now? Are people clicking in and making some of this work? Are we getting the new polling places in enough numbers, enough people trained to work as poll workers? And also a question just on PPE. I mean, some medical frontline workers are have at times struggled to get just PPE. How are we doing on the workers that we are training to work the polling places in terms of just their safety? But give us a little perspective on that.
Let me start with that second question first. In general, the election officials I've talked to said they're fine on PPE. They've got what they need. And they've been preparing for that. In some ways, that's the easiest thing because it just required money and they purchased it and then they just need to distribute it. On the other infrastructural questions, there's a mixed story to tell, and it really varies by jurisdiction. I will say this: for 95% of voters, it's going to be a seamless process, right? But 5% is still a large number. And whether you're talking about absentee ballot challenges and with sort of states trying to deal with the new transition to that, or in healthy polling places, it's a real challenge. Now, all of the main battleground cities, I think I feel comfortable saying this, have now said they have enough poll workers. I worry that they might not be keeping a large enough reserve list because I expect there to be a 10% or more flake rate on people who signed up to be poll workers. Polling places, I think we're in a pretty good space there. One of the problems right now is we really don't know. We can't predict how many people are going to show up to vote. So that is quite challenging. You've seen what the long lines in places like Atlanta recently. And those should have been avoidable. Now they've calmed down. I mean, a lot of this just has to do with the enthusiasm of early voting, where thousands of people show up in the first 2 days, but then the line tapers off. But I mean, I've been impressed with the way the election officials are preparing for this election, and there's some things that are outside of their control, but for the vast majority of them, I think they're very well prepared and doing a serious job.
We have a strong narrative, I would say, in the national press that shares anxiety around not getting this right. But you mentioned that at the local level, there's high competency. It does not tack to such a partisan sort of curve as the national conversation does. How does Utah? How are their elections in Utah, where this has been, mail-in voting is quite common? In fact, it's the rule.
Yes, well, I mean, it's just like Oregon and Washington. There was sort of a remarkable video I just saw between the two gubernatorial candidates, I think, in Utah, where they both did a kind of PSA together, urging civility and acceptance of election results. It was kind of it was sort of a bizarre world that we are not living in, but only in Utah, right? And so, Utah is an example of one of those states where Republicans are very much in favor of mail balloting, both in the administration and the politicians who are there. And so it's been quite successful there. And as I said, you go down to the local level and you see that even in states like Florida, where it's obviously about as partisan as it gets at the state level, but the local registrars, Florida has historically had a third voting by mail, a third voting early, and a third voting in person on election day. It will probably be roughly half who end up voting by mail, maybe a quarter who vote early, and then another quarter who do it on election day.
So just to be clear, Utah does not experience an enormous amount of voter fraud.
None of these, look, there are always examples of fraud, that one can point to, but there's no systematic sort of difference between vote by mail states and non-vote by mail states in the likelihood that they have fraud.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and thank you guys. We're getting some good stuff in the Q&A. Keep that coming. We have in attendance here Tim Ritchie, who's the publisher at the Fresno Bee, and I think he's going to put a question in, but I'm going to ask a question on his behalf also. Local journalism has a role to play in covering this election, obviously. What are you seeing that works in terms of local journalism, getting it right in terms of where to focus the lens and to not scare people off from what is our democratic responsibility and how well their communities will do in managing this?
So there are two little nuggets of undisconnected advice I would give here. The first is that, of course, as with plane crashes, right? You report on the crash itself, but you don't report on the millions of successful flights, right? So there are problems, and that's where people gravitate. However, when it comes to elections, on something like whether it's lines in polling places or violence in polling places, it is extremely important to get it right as to whether what you're observing is a one-off kind of problem or whether it's a systemic one, because we should be very concerned if what ends up happening is that the kind of worst case scenario or the worst example of election dysfunction is then being viewed as a larger problem than it really is. And that's particularly true. Like, for example, take lines in polling places where we always, focus on that. 95% of Americans will be able to vote in under a half an hour in this election, and was true in last election. There will, for 5%, it is a problem, and that's unacceptable. But for that matter, even for that 5%, most of them are going to vote with under an hour. But there are going to be some precincts where either poll workers don't show up, machines break down, or there's some other administrative staff foo, much of which is avoidable. Okay, but still, we need to put that in context. The second thing I would say is how absolutely critical local journalism is to communicating especially in this election, the changes to voting, right? So that for people to understand how to vote in this election and where to vote, local journalists are going to be absolutely critical there, because they are going to be better positioned to amplify the voices of the local election officials who are going to be making these changes, as well as to hold them accountable, right? To make sure that they are actually satisfying voter demand, making sure that they are making the changes that are necessary. But there are going to be lots of polling places that are changed this year. There are going to be lots of changes in the way people vote, right? There's been great local journalism on teaching people how to vote a mail ballot if they've never done it before, as well as other instructions that would be relevant to voting in polling places.
So all of this is also occurring with the backdrop of a Supreme Court nominee making their way to a vote. A lot of folks are anxious that this thing is going to end up at the Supreme Court somehow through litigation after the election if it's contested. We had a recent ruling in Pennsylvania. Can you speak to that ruling and maybe also give some perspective on what role the Supreme Court might have to play in resolving some of this potential litigation?
Sure. We also actually, just before we came on, we got another Supreme Court ruling today on a case out of Alabama. So let me start with the Pennsylvania case. So 2 weeks ago, there was a petition to the Supreme Court coming out of Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court interpreted the state constitution and said that the deadlines that were in the law for receipt of absentee ballots violated the rights of voters. And so they extended the deadline so that if a ballot is cast on election day or earlier, but and postmarked as such, but it's received 3 days after the election, it will still be counted. The Republicans challenged that ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court, basically saying that what the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did was effectively usurp the power of the legislature, which under the Constitution has a kind of special authority because Article 2, Section 1 says each state shall determine in a manner provided by the legislature thereof a number of electors. So the idea in the Constitution, the Republicans argued, was that the courts can't behave like super legislatures and essentially rewrite the election code. Now, at the Supreme Court, the decision was 4-4, which means that the lower court decision, in this case, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, stands. That is, not a healthy situation for us to be in, that you have a divided Supreme Court on critical questions of election administration this close to an election. How Amy Coney Barrett, if she is elevated to the Supreme Court before the election, how she would decide a case like this, we don't really know. She's an originalist, like Justice Thomas, who's on the was part of the 4 that would have overturned the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, and so perhaps she would have gone with that and crafted a 5-4 decision. I'll say today, though, we did get a decision off an Alabama case where basically a lower court judge had struck down Alabama's ban on curbside voting, which would allow certain people who are afraid of catching the virus to be able to vote from their cars. And the appellate court basically, so there was a stay, and it went its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-3 decision, with the 3 more liberal justices dissenting, basically reversed that ban on, or upheld the ban on curbside voting, and so Alabamians won't be able to vote curbside. So it really sort of just depends on where we think Chief Justice Roberts otherwise would have gone as to whether Amy Coney Barrett's nomination makes a difference or not.
I want to do a quick follow on that. I mean, this is not an issue that is owned by one particular political party, right? For many years, the Democratic Party in the Deep South disenfranchised millions of Americans from their right to vote through poll taxes and all kinds of other measures, including violence. But we expect, I think, in this day and age, that there's some level of fairness to be had. But there's a lot of concern right now that some of what's happening in the national dialogue has the potential to result in voter suppression. Do you worry about that?
I do worry about that, but I will tell you, and this should be reflective of my motivation in starting the Healthy Elections Project. I am as worried, if not more worried, about dysfunction and poor resource allocation and poor management and how that affects voting rights as I am from partisan voter suppression. Because a lot of these cities, like the battleground cities, places like Milwaukee and Detroit and Philadelphia, Atlanta, Miami-Dade, right? These are places, these are democratically run cities that are, that are making decisions about how to allocate resources to polling places, vote by mail, and the like. And their decisions are just as critical as the ones that are being made at the state level over voting rules. And for the point of contact of voters, it really makes a difference, kind of what service they're getting from their local officials.
Many of those places you cited have great local newspapers, I will also point out, and great local public radio. We've got amazing questions coming in right now, Nate. So I want to actually start to weave those in. I'm going to just go from the top. Some of these you can do quickly if they're really pretty straightforward. Can you provide any insight on security measures and redundancies states have in place that keep voting by mail accurate and secure?
So the main way that we secure absentee voting and making sure that there isn't fraud is to verify the signatures on absentee ballots with the signatures that are on file in a on file from the DMV or in the voter file, right? And we did an interesting report actually last year on signature verification. I had some students who were just really interested in this issue, and California passed something called the Every Vote Counts Act. And so you can check out that publication on our website. And so that's the way that we verify ballots to make sure there isn't fraud. Now, this question about sort of redundancy and verification, I mean, a lot of what ends up happening in the event we're in a recount situation, I mean, all absentee ballots are paper ballots. So in some ways, they're the easiest to keep a permanent record of. For the most part, over 80, probably over 90% of ballots that will be cast in this election will be paper ballots, absentee or polling place ballots that actually have a paper record. So there's a lot of, we're more secure now than we were when we sort of made the transition to electronic voting.
Good question. Thank you for that. This is a quick one. I mean, you showed South Korea where they've got all the measures in place to keep track of folks who might be COVID positive. How commonly will poll workers be taking the temperature of persons showing up to vote? If somebody has an elevated temperature, do they kick them out of the polling place?
They're not going here. They're not going to take the temperature of voters. In fact, one of the big controversies this year is whether you can require voters to wear a mask, and that basically the rule is that they are going to be encouraged to wear masks, but that most states have said that no voter can be deprived of the right to vote in a polling place by their refusal to wear a mask. So we're very different than South Korea in the way that we deal with this. We're not going to be taking temperatures. You know, we have a much sort of more libertarian impulse.
Any sense of what the voter turnout in South Korea's election was?
Higher than ours.
Okay, pluses and minuses of getting a vote by mail ballot, but deciding instead to vote in person.
So this is an interesting question. So if you
That's from
already,
Michael, by the way.
what'd you say?
Michael asked that question. Just to
Well,
follow up.
so there's two ways to answer this. So uh, in general, is it better to vote in person or vote by mail? And then specifically, if you've already requested a mail ballot, what's the best way to vote? So um, it depends what we mean by best here, right? And so there, for different people, I think different voting methods are going to be more appropriate. Um, the first thing I would say is that the ballots that are cast in polling places on election day are going to be in many, I won't say they'll be the first ones counted because that's not always true depending on the state you're talking about, but it is the one where you have the least chain of custody issues than you would have with other systems of voting. I mean, for the most part, I'm encouraging people to vote early in person if they have that option to relieve the strain on election officials on election day and also to bank the votes to make sure that those get counted. If you have already requested an absentee ballot, then really what you should do is bring that absentee ballot and you want to vote in person, then bring that absentee ballot to the polling place to make sure that that ballot is spoiled and then you can vote your actual ballot. One of the problems we are seeing this year is that really millions of people are showing up in these early voting centers having requested an absentee ballot, and then many of them are getting provisional ballots, which are going to be the last votes to count.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. Okay, we're going to go to Heather's question, which is, would you speak to the ability to track your ballot online? Is that a state-by-state decision to have that tool? Is it common? Is it equal in every community?
It is a state by state decision, and sometimes it varies by county. We have a whole map on healthyelections.org. If you go to the other research section where we show the ballot tracking software, there are two main products that are used: Ballot Tracks and Ballot Scout, and they serve the purpose of allowing voters to figure out where in the system their mail ballot is.
I want to go back to March when a lot of the shutdowns kicked in around the pandemic. If we had started then and did everything in our power as a country and local communities to get this right, could we have done better than where we were standing right here today?
Yes, there are things we could have done back then that we cannot do today. A lot of it has to do with the procurement of certain types of material, particularly ballot drop boxes. And we are now kind of rushing toward the finish line here, where the an alternative to the postal service is not as available to us as it could have been. That's just one example. I think that there are others in order to prepare polling places, voters, election officials. And it sort of depends at what level you're asked the question. Like, for example, with the Postal Service, obviously the Postal Service has been under incredible stress, right? And a lot of those problems were learned about in the spring. If we had prepared, with the Postal Service to be better adapted to deal with the election, maybe we'd be in a different place with that right now as well.
Okay, from an anonymous attendee, which is your right in a Zoom session, will state and local results generally be available sooner than the presidential race, or will all the results be potentially delayed?
The state and local results will be no faster than the presidential races, I guess the way to put it. So some places they'll be slower because the first votes that will be reported will be presidential, but it's not as if that they will be counted first because the ballot is the ballot. So whenever you put that into the scanning machine, it's automatically tallied for all the races. There will be some, I'll say something probably is obvious, which is that we do not have a national reporter of elections in the United States, not a government body that does that like most countries do. For the most part, we outsource that power to the Associated Press. And the Associated Press does call local races like state legislative races and the like. And so they will probably be more likely to call some of those local races before they would the presidential race. But that's just because it's smaller levels of geography that are politically homogeneous.
How long has that been the setup?
Well, 100 years. The Associated Press has been doing this. They there's
Should we update it? I mean, is this appropriate given the complexities?
it's completely inappropriate. And actually, I have an article in Slate today on precisely this topic, and questioning whether it's really such a good thing to have the media decision desks, let alone the Associated Press, play this outsized role. The problem, but this is a problem about the US election administration system generally, which is that we don't have any centralized authority to administer the election, let alone to report the results. Now, that's in some ways baked into the constitutional structure with the Electoral College and the fact that we vest state legislatures with this power. But it is a peculiar feature if you're someone from outside the US who's coming to observe us to then see that 10,000 local jurisdictions are in charge of elections. And then the reporting is done by the media. It is a sort of strange role.
Is there a danger, though, if you had that central authority and then you had an administration that was either skeptical or outright aggressive towards some of what is standard practice in elections? What's the risk there?
That's right. I mean, decentralization is also a blessing as well as a curse, right? So, as we were talking about the different cities that are administering the election, they end up being buffers against potential partisan attempts at the state or federal level.
Uh, Great. And thank you for the person who put that in there. I want to come back. It touches on the disenfranchisement and potential intimidation, but somebody asked a question around poll watchers and how much of an impact will they have? And is there not a right to privacy while voting? What's the insulation that is guaranteed when you go to vote in person?
So we just put up a report at healthyelections.org on poll watchers, voter intimidation, and violence, and how different states deal with them. So I commend the questioner to that. So poll watchers are not a bad thing. Okay, election observers are not a bad thing. It's one of the ways that we make sure that people in the polling place are having their voting rights protected, as well as that there's not fraud going on, that people are not stuffing ballot boxes. But there's a fine line between observation and intimidation, and that line has to be policed very aggressively. And so, generally speaking, right, a poll observer or an election observer is somewhere in the polling place, but not looking over the shoulders of voters, but just making sure that voters are shuttled into the process and allowed to vote without hindrance. There are states where these observers can then challenge voters' legality or that whether they have the right to vote. That's when this could turn into something much more dangerous if you have serial challenges to the legitimacy of voters. And different states have different ways of dealing with that.
You know, can I do one quick double click on that? So if you go to vote and you get up there, you're doing your thing, and somebody says, "I challenge their right to vote, their legitimacy," what do you do as the person trying to vote?
Well, it depends on the state, what we're talking about here. In general, the laws say that you've got to have some basis. You can't just start random challenging people. So there has to be some basis for it. Whatever happens, you cannot be deprived of your right to vote. So if you fall into that challenge category, you will then be able to at least vote a provisional ballot, which will then be counted, assuming that there is no legal problem. I mean, one of the concerns this year is that there might be just sort of serial challenges of voters that then would throw a lot of these votes into that provisional category and create an environment of uncertainty. But again, I don't want to raise the temperature in an unwarranted way right now. We'll wait to see whether something like that happens. But the state administrators are prepared for that, right? They know that this might be coming down the pike. And so if someone behaves like that in a polling place, they try to obstruct voters, they'll be escorted out.
I would also put a marker down on the role of local journalism to cover in a comprehensive way. That way, to your point, we're not overblowing a single thing, but also we're not missing if there's something that is happening. Given that states control voting, maybe you do this. Is there a way to evaluate and measure how effective they are in the process of that management?
Yes, there's something called the Election Performance Index that my colleague Charles Stewart has developed at MIT, my co-founder of the Healthy Elections Project. And so with every election, they rank states according to an array of criteria developed from something called the Survey of the Performance of the American Electorate, which combines all kinds of data on election performance.
And who's the best? What state wins?
It usually ends up being like some of the Midwestern states because they seem to do well. Places like Minnesota and Dakotas and the like, just because they always end up doing well on kind of these civic management indexes.
Got it. And can you cite who's got the most room to improve?
There are places in the deep south that often score low.
Okay.
But let me also say this, which is that it's not, it doesn't fall on what you might think of as a red blue divide. Like the Northeast has historically been an election administration backwater. And you saw some of this on display with New York in the primary elections this year, where upwards of 20% of their absentee ballots in the primary ended up not being counted. And we have such extreme decentralization in those kind of sort of New England townships and the like, that it doesn't fall on like sort of predictable partisan divides. The Northeast has really been a problem when it comes to election administration.
I'm going to try to get to this question without going into another hour conversation, but I will say this on behalf of my two kids who are voters. The electoral college to them makes no sense. Shaquille O'Neal recently admitted that this was the first time he had voted in a national election, and on his podcast, he had to break down what the electoral college is all about. And he's like, "What? Do you feel like we're running out of this? Well, what role will the function of the electoral college play against this sort of administration of just the elections issue? Do you see those things in any way grading against each other, or we go to the Supreme Court? Like, what are the possible sort of tensions around that system?"
Well, so the Electoral College is a relic of the past and sort of the peculiar origin story of the United States moving from states into a federal government, right? It is both unequal, right? So we've seen this in two elections in the last 20 years where the majority winner then ends up not winning the election. And so, if you were developing a new democracy today and you were to craft it according to the American Constitution, most people would say that's not democratic. So there's that problem, which is a big problem. And there are several problems, both in the fact that we don't have a national popular vote, but then also that we have malapportioned the electoral college so that their smaller states end up getting a bonus in terms of the presidential vote. How that dovetails with election administration is kind of interesting. It does, in some ways, provide a buffer against analyzing all states and their election administration maladies, and so we focus on the 6 to 10 battleground states and focus in on those and for the presidency. If we had a national popular vote, then we wouldn't be spending as much time, say, in Florida or in Pennsylvania, but we'd be thinking about it more broadly. And so, it's as we were talking about with decentralization generally, it's a blessing and a curse.
I want to get a couple more in. We may not get to all the questions though, but I do appreciate it, and we will try to follow up with them. Quick question: are there controls to prevent voting in multiple jurisdictions?
Yes, to some extent. There's something called the Electronic Registration Information Center, which half the states are members of, which trade information about voter registration over state lines so that when you register in one state, you're automatically taken off the registration in another state. But there are examples, of snowbirds voting in New York and Florida. Sometimes that happens, but the main check on this is that it's illegal, so don't do it.
So it's still illegal. We're just about out of time. I have two more questions I want to get to though. Let's say that we get this reasonably well done, right? We get a B average across the country. How will we know that we did okay under very, very complicated conditions with a lot of tension, a lot of stress? I keep wondering when the fever is going to break in this country and we're going to look around and say, we got to wake up in the morning and just be together, right? How will we know that we made it through without a huge disaster erupting?
Well, there's something that's called the election administrator's prayer, and that is, oh God, whatever happens, please don't let it be close, right? Because in a close election, all of the vulnerabilities of the system seem to be outcome determinant, right? And so to some extent, it's out of the election administrator's hands as to whether we see this as a disaster or not. You look at what happened in Florida, right? No one was thinking about this machine behind me, the Palm Beach butterfly ballot machine, right, which determined the outcome of that election, was not a problem that they had seen coming into it. And so, in general, the number of lost votes, the number of contested ballots, those are metrics that we can look to see whether we had problems or not, let alone the absence of violence in polling places, absence of lines, all of those kinds of things would be metrics against which we can measure our performance.
So I'm a board member at Consumer Reports, in addition to having the honor of serving on the James B. McClatchy Foundation board. The idea of just fairness, just good behavior, counts for something. And not to single them out on a partisan basis, but the certain parts of the Republican Party in California were placing unofficial ballot boxes in strategic locations. Is that bad behavior?
Yes.
Should they not do that?
There's no other way to say it. I mean, obviously, partly because they marked them as official ballot drop boxes, which they're not. So that in and of itself is deception. So you worry that there would be ballots that would end up in those ballot drop boxes that wouldn't eventually make it to the election administrators. What they would say is, look, they were trying to highlight the problem of what they call ballot harvesting, which is the loss of chain of custody in ballots. But the way to do that is to change the law, not to do this in a kind of guerrilla warfare way.
Yeah, and again, this is both major political parties suffer from these kinds of examples, some more egregious than others. I met an 80-something-year-old woman in Clarksdale, Mississippi, who had to pay the equivalent of a week's salary to just pay to get into the vote before it was widely available to African Americans in the state of Mississippi. And she still walks amongst us. We were there with grandchildren. Priscilla, I want to get you ready to roll back in here as we go to a close. And I'll make one note, and I want to thank everybody for attending. I also want to thank Susan McClatchy for all the support that she's offered. And I never got a chance to meet James, but I learned a lot about his legacy. And Priscilla, I'm going to ask you a question here before you wrap us up. He spoke a lot about the common person and the underdog, right? Especially in California Central Valley. And it seems to me like that's who we need to get this right for, right? Is the person who needs fair playing fields, even playing fields, and the rules to be followed in order to participate fully in our democracy. So, Priscilla, any notes or thoughts on tonight's conversation and the work of the foundation before we say goodnight to everyone?
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Joaquin. I just want to say that what you said about James McClatchy is very true. He cared very deeply about the marginalized communities and folks whose voices were not heard. And I think that's where the foundation is now stepping into, lifting up those voices. And I think this talk, Nate and Joaquin, thank you so much for your knowledge, and it's been so informative and relevant. And as Nate said, this is an all hands on deck moment, and as a way to get everybody involved. And your voice and your vote matter in this all hands on deck moment. What I want to say too is to everyone who joined us is to be safe in this COVID environment. And, just a takeaway from another fact that Nate brought up is, the aging poll worker. And so if you can volunteer or sign up to be a poll worker, please do that. I mean, in addition to casting your vote, that's something that you could do. I want to quickly thank a few folks that I didn't mention earlier. The SAC JLC, the Judicial Learning Center, especially Courtney Lynn and Clark Kelso for their planning. They are board members. Square 32, Jenny Breister for marketing and outreach. Of course, Studio To Be, Joaquin and his partner Joel Juarez for their production quality. It's been really great. And of course, for Nate and Joaquin for your time, knowledge, and passion for our democracy. And of course, everyone who joined us this evening for your time. And if anyone cares, I think Tampa Bay is up by 3, and it's the bottom of the 7th. So we still have a few more innings.
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you, Nate. And I'm going to just put a slide up here. Please go to healthyelections.org. Nate, you did excellent and wonderful work tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.